$50 billion. That was the offer. A humanitarian megaproject promised by none other than Bill Gates himself, a vaccine production hub called Vaxvine, to be built in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. On paper, it sounded like salvation, jobs, infrastructure, independence from imported medicine. It was marketed as Africa's big leap forward in public health. But President Ibrahim Traoré looked the world's richest philanthropist in the eye and said one word: number. Not maybe. Not under negotiation. Just no. And in doing so, he triggered a storm, not just in Africa, but in boardrooms, embassies, editorial rooms from Geneva to New York, because this wasn't just about vaccines. It was about power, about memory, and about refusing to be fooled again. Why did Traoré reject what the world celebrated? What hidden forces did he see behind the smiling faces and corporate pledges? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and keep watching to understand why Traoré dared to say no to Bill Gates, a bold decision to protect the future of an entire continent. In July 2025, global headlines lit up with praise. Bill Gates, through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, announced a plan to invest $50 billion into constructing a state-of-the-art vaccine production center in Burkina Faso. The initiative, named Vaxvine, was to be headquartered in Ouagadougou and aimed to become a flagship project for Africa's health independence. The vision seemed noble: to equip the continent with its own capacity to produce vaccines at scale against malaria, tuberculosis, even future pandemics. For the international community, it was a shining symbol of philanthropy and public-private cooperation. World Health Organization, WHO, officials, G7 leaders, and Western media hailed the move as a turning point for Africa. But inside Burkina Faso, something felt different. President Ibrahim Traoré, barely 40, born from revolution and distrustful of soft power, didn't see salvation. He saw a trap, and he wasted no time making it known. In a nationally televised address, he declared the project a humanitarian disguise for resource extraction. According to him, the proposed deal would not only require control over local raw materials such as shea, moringa, and rare medicinal plants, but would also grant foreign partners access to sensitive health data, local biological samples, and intellectual property ownership of future treatments. This is not partnership, Traoré said. This is colonization in a lab coat. He argued that if Vaxvine were truly for Africans, it would be owned by Africans, run by African scientists, and funded without strings. Instead, he claimed the deal was structured in ways that gave disproportionate decision-making power to Western stakeholders under the guise of technical assistance. Even more concerning to Traoré was the timing. As Africa's youth increasingly demanded sovereignty over healthcare and agriculture, this sudden offer of monumental scale, framed as a gift, felt too familiar, too strategic. They're not here to help us stand, Traoré said. They're here to keep us on our knees, grateful, dependent, and silent. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't simply reject a vaccine deal, he triggered a confrontation with history itself. In his speech, he began peeling back decades of what he called charity with a colonial face. He cited one example that still haunted the African medical community: Kenya, 2014. That year, a coalition of Catholic doctors discovered something deeply disturbing. Tetanus vaccines, being administered to young women under a WHO-supported program, were allegedly laced with HCG hormones, a compound known to cause sterility. The campaign, promoted as a maternal health program, was accused of secretly functioning as a population control strategy. They didn't come to save our women, Traoré said. They came to shut their wombs. That wasn't ancient history. Just a few years later, during the COVID-19 crisis in 2021, vaccine manufacturers turned their eyes to Africa once again, not for help, but for human testing. Clinical trials were rushed into countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa. and it wasn't clear that every parent or participant truly understood the risks. To Traoré, this wasn't accidental. They needed our children. He said, not for protection, but for data, for profit. They were live test subjects in a pharmaceutical experiment that would never have been allowed in Europe. His outrage only grew as he described the early rollout of mRNA vaccines in Zimbabwe and South Africa in 2022, where several cases of unexpected autoimmune reactions raised alarms. Western agencies labeled these as rare anomalies, but Traoré wasn't convinced. They claim to fight disease, he said, but their medicine kills molecules in our bodies they don't even understand. And when we get sick from their cures, we have to buy more drugs from the very same companies that caused it. To him, this wasn't about health. It was a market strategy. Create the disease, offer the treatment, and dominate the system. He called it a loop of dependency that wears a lab coat. But President Ibrahim Traoré didn't stop at vaccine trials. He turned the spotlight onto Bill Gates himself, not as a philanthropist, but as a symbol of monopoly and quiet conquest. He reminded the world of something many Americans over 40 remember well: the Microsoft antitrust trial of the late 1992. From 1998 to 2001, Gates's empire was taken to court by the US government for crushing competition, manipulating the tech market, and treating consumers as captives rather than clients. Monopoly was never an accident, Traoré said. It was his business model. To Traoré, Gates had simply shifted tactics. First, he monopolized our software. Now, he wants to monopolize our biology. Then came a more severe accusation, one that echoed across the headlines. Traoré publicly labeled Gates a malevolent force during the COVID-19 pandemic, accusing him of either exploiting or intentionally orchestrating the global crisis. His evidence? The infamous 2015 TED Talk, where Gates warned of a coming pandemic, not in vague terms, but with eerie precision. You call it foresight, Traoré said. I call it rehearsal. But the most damning claims weren't about viruses, they were about genes. Traoré pointed to the Gates Foundation's support of a Pan-African research initiative called H3 Africa, which began in 2018. Framed as a health data revolution, H3 Africa gathered genetic samples from African populations under the guise of medical advancement. Traoré was blunt. Our DNA is being harvested and sold. He accused Gates of building pipelines of biological data to Western pharmaceutical firms without informed consent, compensation, or sovereignty. And it didn't stop at genes. Gates's influence, Traoré claimed, extended deep into African classrooms and newsrooms. Since 2017, the Gates Foundation has spent hundreds of millions funding educational reforms and media outlets in countries like Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. But Traoré wasn't impressed. They don't want our children educated. They want them rewired. To think like the West, to obey, to consume, and to forget who they are. Finally, he tied it all together with one bold claim. Bill Gates is not alone. He called Gates a frontline operator of a G7 agenda designed to recolonize Africa through medicine, media, and markets. They don't need armies anymore, he said. They have algorithms and charity. To many outside observers, rejecting a $50 billion investment might seem like a missed opportunity. But to President Ibrahim Traoré, accepting it would have been surrender, not of money, but of sovereignty. In his detailed breakdown of the proposed Vaxvine project, Traoré exposed what he called the fine print of dependence. According to his administration's analysts, over 70% of the facility's critical machinery, data servers, and research protocols would be sourced directly from US and European suppliers, all under exclusive licensing contracts. It wouldn't be our factory, Traoré told the press. It would be a fortress, built on our soil, guarded by their patents, feeding their profits. Worse still, the agreement reportedly included clauses that allowed foreign partners access to Burkina Faso's national health database, anonymized but fully exportable, what they call anonymized data, Traoré warned, can still be mined for biological trends, population behavior, and resource planning. In the wrong hands, that's not science, that's surveillance. He called the project a digital plantation, where Africans would labor in sterile factories, producing vaccines and components that would mostly be exported, while decisions, profits, and scientific ownership would remain offshore. Traoré asked a pointed question that resonated across the continent. What good is a vaccine facility if we own nothing it produces? Local economists began calling the Vaxvine deal a Trojan horse of health diplomacy. Public protests grew in Ouagadougou, Bobo, Dioulasso, and Koudougou, not just against the factory, but against the larger pattern of resource extraction disguised as development. Civil society leaders raised concerns about a future where public health policy would be indirectly written in Seattle or Brussels, not by African scientists, but by foreign investors with philanthropic branding. The danger, Traoré said, isn't just in the medicine, it's in the blueprint, it's in the ownership of cure and code. It's the same pattern, just dressed in humanitarian white. While the world waited for Burkina Faso to fall in line with global vaccine policy, President Traoré turned inward toward Africa's roots. Rather than chase pharmaceutical partnerships that left the country indebted and dependent, he launched a bold counter-initiative, the creation of a National Institute for Indigenous Medicine and Public Health Sovereignty. Its mission was clear: revive, study, and scale the continent's ancestral healing knowledge and integrate it with modern science on Africa's terms. We don't reject medicine, Traoré said. We reject monopoly. We reject the idea that science must be owned by someone else to be valid. He listed dozens of indigenous plants already used for generations. Neem leaves for immunity and skin infections. Artemisia annua, long used against malaria. Moringa seeds rich in antioxidants and used in digestive treatments. Baobab fruit, a staple in immune-boosting traditional tonics. To the West, these were just herbs. But to Africa, they were legacy, resilience, and knowledge, passed through war, drought, colonization, and exile. Pharmacological teams composed of Burkinabe, Malian, and Ghanaian researchers began cataloguing formulas handed down orally by village healers and herbalists. With support from traditional chieftains and elders, the government launched pilot community health centers where patients could choose between Western treatments or certified ancestral therapies. The announcement triggered outrage from some international health NGOs who labeled it anti-science. But Traoré fired back. This is science. It just doesn't belong to you. He emphasized that this wasn't isolationism, it was self-determination. He invited partnerships with countries that respected Africa's agency, but made it clear Burkina Faso would no longer be a passive market for imported cures. The nation's health policy was no longer a matter of charity. It had become an act of resistance and revival. So what happens when a small nation refuses the medicine of empires and turns instead to the wisdom buried in its own soil? At first, the Western press didn't know what to do with Ibrahim Traoré, a 30-something African president who just rejected $50 billion. That wasn't supposed to happen, and certainly not in a country as economically fragile as Burkina Faso. Mainstream media outlets responded with a mix of confusion and disdain. The Financial Times called him reckless. Le Monde said he was playing politics with public health. And a New York op-ed asked whether he was too radical for modern diplomacy. But behind the headlines, something deeper was happening. In the American public, particularly among the generation that lived through the Iraq War, the 2008 financial crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic, Traoré's defiance struck a nerve. His rejection of corporate philanthropy echoed past warnings about big pharma, data privacy, and the dangers of foreign intervention dressed as aid. In independent circles on platforms like Substack, Reddit, and alternative media writers began comparing Traoré to Malcolm X, Thomas Sankara, and even JFK, not because he was perfect, but because he challenged the unchallengeable. He said what no Western leader would dare say, wrote one US columnist. He connected Gates, G7, genetic data, vaccine politics, and then said no. That takes a kind of courage our politicians forgot long ago. In communities of color across the US, particularly among black intellectuals and health advocates, his words had even more weight. Many remembered the Tuskegee syphilis study, where African American men were experimented on without consent. To them, Traoré's accusations weren't conspiracy. They were historical warnings revisited. The West hears outrage, said one Detroit professor, but we hear recognition. Meanwhile, grassroots African American activists began rallying under a new slogan, Africa, for Africans, globally. The ripple effects of Traoré's refusal spread quickly across the global south. In Latin America, commentators on Telesur praised his courage, comparing it to past resistance movements in Cuba, Venezuela, and Bolivia. Leaders in Mali and Guinea, already aligned in anti-imperial partnerships, echoed his sentiments, calling for a revolution in medical sovereignty. In Asia, independent voices in India and Indonesia questioned why their own nations had allowed vaccine giants to dictate terms during the pandemic, while a small African country had the boldness to say no. Even within Europe, cracks appeared. In France, youth organizations, particularly within African diaspora communities, staged demonstrations outside media headquarters demanding fair coverage of Traoré's speech. "You called him reckless," one protester shouted. "But he's the only one being honest." In the United States, the mainstream political class remained largely silent, perhaps wary of questioning a figure as entrenched as Bill Gates. But among the older American public, especially veterans, retired teachers, and blue-collar workers, the message resonated. We've seen what it looks like when power wears a friendly face. More than a politician, Traoré had become a symbol, not just for Africans, not just for the oppressed, but for anyone who remembered what it meant to resist and to believe that dignity doesn't come with a price tag. If you believe Traoré's courage speaks for all of Africa, speak up in the comments. Your voice matters now more than ever. Just when global attention began to fade, President Traoré dropped the bombshell. At a press conference in early August 2025, his Minister of Science and Innovation unveiled a confidential dossier, a 178-page document titled The Vaxvine Protocols. It contained internal communications, memoranda, and signed pre-contract agreements between international partners and local subcontractors. What it revealed shook even his critics. The blueprint for Vaxvine included clauses granting third-party access to biometric health data of participating citizens. A parallel project titled BioTrace, funded by a subsidiary linked to a Gates-affiliated venture capital firm, sought to install wearable devices in rural clinics, ostensibly for vaccine monitoring, but with real-time geolocation, tracking, and health behavior analytics. Another segment confirmed collaboration with CloudGene, a biotech firm previously accused of exporting African DNA datasets for proprietary drug development in Europe. "We were not being offered a factory," Traoré said. "We were being offered a Trojan server injected into our health system, our privacy, our future." The most shocking part? Several documents dated back to 2021, 4 years before the offer was made public, indicating that the deal had been in quiet development without democratic oversight. That revelation lit a firestorm in West Africa. Activists demanded accountability. Civil servants resigned. University students took to the streets chanting, "Our blood is not a business." Burkina Faso, once framed as the lucky recipient of global charity, was now the case study for digital exploitation in the age of humanitarianism. And as the truth unfolded, Traoré made his next move, one that would change the balance of power far beyond his own borders. In the weeks that followed the Vaxvine expose, Ibrahim Traoré didn't retreat into silence. He doubled down, and he didn't do it alone. At an emergency summit in Bamako, he convened with heads of state from Mali, Guinea, Niger, and diplomatic envoys from Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran. The result? A declaration that stunned global observers, the PAN, African Pact for Medical Sovereignty. The pact called for a moratorium on foreign-led health infrastructure projects without full scientific transparency, the establishment of a continental database of traditional medicine protected under African copyright and governance, and most notably, the creation of a new regional vaccine research consortium led by African scientists, with support from friendly nations outside the G7 bloc. This was no longer just a national stance, it had become a continental realignment. In his closing speech, Traoré declared, "The virus we must defeat is not only biological, it is geopolitical. It is the belief that we are forever patients, never the healers." Today, we become both. Burkina Faso, once seen as one of the poorest nations on earth, had repositioned itself as a philosophical leader, not through wealth, but through conviction. And in classrooms, clinics, and parliaments across the global south, his voice echoed not as a cry for help, but as a call to rise. What began as one man's refusal had now become a movement built not on charity, but on dignity. Burkina Faso did not gain a factory. It gained something far greater, its voice. President Ibrahim Traoré could have accepted $50 billion, stood beside billionaires, and called it progress. But instead, he stood alone. He chose truth over applause, history over headlines, and dignity over dependency. In a world where silence is often safer, he raised his voice not just for his people, but for a continent long treated as a test site, a charity case, a resource bank, and what began as refusal became revival. Traditional medicine now shares the table with modern science. African scientists are leading African solutions, and Burkina Faso is no longer a footnote in someone else's mission. It's a headline in its own right. "We did not ask for permission to be free," Traoré said. "We stood up and took it. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe to continue the journey of an Africa that no longer bows. God bless Africa. God bless those who still choose courage."